The Holy Gospel for this Sunday is recorded in what is known as the Sermon on the Mount, written in Matthew chapter 5. Please rise for its reading as you're able. Jesus said to the disciples, "You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment.' But I say to you, that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you are liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you are liable to the council. And if you say, 'You fool,' you will be liable to the hell of fire. So when you're offering your gift at the altar, and if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're on the way to court with him, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you'll be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny." The Gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated, and my children friends, come on up for a children's message. A troubled wife came in to talk to her pastor. What she wanted to talk about was her unhappiness and struggle within her marriage. And when she got done speaking, the pastor tried to summarize, and he said to her, "So do I hear that your husband has forgotten the last 4 or 5 Valentine's Day without giving you anything? And that he has sometimes in the past said things that have been hurtful for you, and that he doesn't like your family at all? That doesn't sound real good. I'm wondering," my friend the pastor said, "have you ever thought about divorce?" She said, "Pastor, divorce? I would never think of divorce. Homicide, yes, not divorce." In Deuteronomy, we hear the admonition, "Choose life. Choose life so that your descendants may live." What we're hearing today is that Jesus wants us to make such an important discovery that how we relate to each other is an important part of how we choose to live life. In the Sermon on the Mount that we're reading now today, it goes on for a number of verses longer. Jesus picks up a formula where he says, "You have heard from ancient times," or to ancient people. He picks up the law, but then he says, "But I say to you," and he picks up the theme of, you've heard it said about murder, about adultery, about divorce, taking oaths, retaliation, and loving the enemy. Today we're going to only pick up the first item that Jesus is referring to, about murder. We have discovered 2 things about Jesus and his teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. Number 1 is that Jesus is not diminishing the Old Testament law, saying, "That's not important, but now I have something really important for you." It's not that at all. He is really saying that I'm going to give you a practical application of what that law means. But secondly, Jesus is saying the law is not meant to be a guide for holy living. It is meant to be a guide for us to live in healthy relationships. And so today we're talking about the first issue that Jesus raised when he said, "You shall not murder, and whoever commits murder is liable for judgment. But I say to you, anyone guilty of anger is liable for judgment." You see, what this is all saying in the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus gives some practical application to the law. He's saying about God cares about healthy relationships. Have you ever thought about that? God cares about your relationships that you have in your life, whether it's people in your immediate family or very close friends or work relationships or our time in school. God cares about how we relate to other people. And some of those relationships are not the easy ones. It's like that Uncle Ole that you see once a year, and he reminds you every year that you see him that you put on a pound or 2. Or he recognizes that you always got a couple more wrinkles around your eyes that you never had. I did have an Uncle Willard like that. It may include the neighbor who has that beautiful lab dog that comes over sometime at nighttime, knocks over your garbage can to find a midnight snack. Yes, it might be that person at work who works in the carrel next to you that knows exactly how to irritate you. It's that person that knows somehow or another how to push those buttons and really sets you up for anger. You see, anger comes in different forms, and I think sometimes we try to define it in a way in which that it really isn't. But I think Jesus is saying anger represents anything that represents a broken relationship, either in terms of what it said or how we think about that other person. Because Jesus did say, and he exhibited in his own ministry, that there are times for appropriate anger. Jesus was angry over injustices that happened in his day. He was angry at the way in which that suffering had its impact on the people that he loved. But it seems like what Jesus is saying clearly to us in this text, it's not anger towards issues that we need to be angry about. His concern is that we're angry with other people. What is it that marks your relationship with people that makes it a struggle? You see, sometimes I think we try to give it a different term, and my loving mother, bless her heart, she said, "Oh, Dad and I never argue. We just discuss." Oh, come on, my Norwegian mother, Doris. Come on, be honest. Sometimes we have that sense of division that we can call it something other than that. But what is it that you would define as a life-restraining brick that sometimes we carry around in our backpack of life that we wish we could get rid of? Some of us know the importance of anger management because we have found out what happens when anger left unrestrained, what it can and what it will do to cause significant harm. But what is Jesus trying to say to us when he compares murder to angry spirits? What Jesus is really saying is that anger towards other people, in whatever form that you may want to call it, and that sense of bitter spirit that goes unchecked will steal life. It has a way of taking away that worth of the other person that we maybe not even stop to think about when we label them or give them an inappropriate name. You see, anger left unattended is much like malignant cancer. It continues to grow. It doesn't stay there. It seems to invest itself and invade the rest of our lives, and it can rob us of sleep, and it can make us so short-fused that when we have something happen at home or at work that really is insignificant, but we pop and we find ourselves expressing our anger in inappropriate ways. Later in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 5, Jesus uses the hyperbole of cutting off body parts if we look at people in disrespectful ways. Jesus doesn't mean that we should cut off our hands or poke out our eyes. He's really saying is that if we do disrespect each other, we need to take action soon because God takes seriously broken relationships. Yes, it is true, folks. God cares about our relationships. You see, what we're seeing here is that Jesus is looking at the Ten Commandments, and he's helping us to see beyond them, or saying to ourselves, murder as we have defined it in the past is not enough. Lingering, continuing anger toward another isn't in Christ's game plan for us. Jesus invites us to see each other through another lens rather than through anger. He calls us to live together in the light of grace and there find a deep respect of the other. And even though we may be upset, that we find ways to let that grace change us so that we can respect the other in a way that Christ respects ourselves. Jesus said, if you come to worship and there you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there and before the altar and then go immediately and be reconciled to your brother and sister, and then come back and finish your worship. I'm not suggesting that some of us should leave right now from worship because we have somebody in mind, but I am thinking that it's very clear that what Jesus is saying is that there's an urgency. There's an urgent call that Jesus has for us to address head-on relationships that have been infected. Deal with that issue now. And then Jesus goes on to say, if someone has something against you and he brings you to court, and Jesus says, settle that issue before you get to court. Jesus is not anti-judicial system. He's simply, again, stressing the urgency of seeking reconciliation. Don't let unfinished business linger. Tend to the broken as soon as possible. The Apostle Paul picked up the same theme in Ephesians. Be angry, but do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. Echoing the same thing, that tension-filled relationships need attention and need it immediately. So when Jesus said, you come to worship and there you're reminded of a broken relationship or something that there's wrong between, there's a barrier between you and that family member or that friend at work, Jesus says, go and tend to it. What he's really saying is, number one, is that the initiative to seek reconciliation is with us, not them. Oh, but Jesus, it's their fault. It's what they said that set me up, and I did what I did, and I have reasons for what I did. Jesus said, leave your gift at the altar, and you take the initiative to seek reconciliation. Waiting for the other to step forward is not the way of Jesus. When we have been convinced that God wants us to choose life, when we understand that the way in which that he wants us to know to live life in its fullness is that we can be out from the burden of carrying around that backpack with those unnecessary items in our lives, Jesus says, take the initiative now. What stops some of us from expressing our regret to the other person is that we are convinced that they won't accept it. They won't know how to accept that word of reconciliation, that word of regret or the sense of remorse or that sense of forgiveness. Jesus says that doesn't make any difference for you. Our responsibility is to go with a hand of grace that says, I come seeking reconciliation. Jesus doesn't put a condition upon their response. But sometimes seeking reconciliation is really hard work. And sometimes I would say it's not even possible or inappropriate to be in a direct encounter. Maybe that person comes to my mind, your mind and mine, that we have some issues with, that person no longer is living. What do we do? Or maybe that person that comes to mind has been remarried or moved on to another job and has a new beginning, and a contact with that person might cause more harm than good. Maybe that person that we've been saying some harsh things about is a politician. A politician who sits on the other side of the aisle from where we are, and it seems so easy to condemn the person. Now, to address the issues, that's one thing, but to address the person is what Jesus is saying, and maybe it's appropriate for us to try our best to bring some sense of harmony, because it's not only injuring the other person, it's what's doing something inside of us that anger left unattended will continue to disturb. Friends, maybe when we can't see a person or we can't call a person or that person's no longer around, maybe writing a letter expressing my deep regret and my wish for a sense of healing and wishing that we would both experience the grace of God that has forgiven us may be the best that we can do. And after writing that letter and maybe reading it to a friend or out loud to yourself and ripping that letter up is the best we can do. Seek reconciliation now. The gospel is a word of grace that shines a light on wounded relationships. That's what Jesus wants for us. Reconciliation brings with it a sense of healing and restoration, making whole that which once was broken or fractured. That's our faith story. That's the way that Christ loves us, even though we have done things to break the relationship that God intended for us and God. But yet he comes and says, you are forgiven, and I want to be made one with you. Jesus wants us to know the fullness of life. Have you been carrying around some bricks in your backpack long enough? Maybe now is the time to address that issue with the same sense of grace that Christ extends to us today. He invites us to look at each other with a new sense of respect and a love, the love that we are loved with. Are you willing to let your anger be bathed with Christ's love today? Are you willing to choose life over carrying around that angry spirit? This coming week, I have 2 items I'd like you to try to attend to. First of all, I'd like you to think about a very important giving relationship that is important to you. Name that relationship, name that person, and ask yourself, what is it that this relationship really has given to you? Secondly, I want us to think about another relationship that has been wounded and maybe continues to be wounded to this day. Something that has been tainted by harsh words or a lingering issue from our past. And then in your own way, I want you to consider, how can I make amends? And maybe in your own way, you can compose a prayer that would say, Lord, grant me the grace to see this person as you see this person, loved and embraced by the same grace that holds me with all of my imperfections. Choose life. Gracious God, help us to be released from the anger that has held us captive and prevented us from experiencing your renewing love. Set us free. Set us free with your powerful love, and thereby choose life. Amen.